The storm had arrived with unrelenting fury. The skies above were an angry shade of gray, and the torrential rain hammered down on the small town of Riverbend like a drumbeat of chaos. Lucas Harper, a 17-year-old boy with sharp green eyes and a heart as big as his ambitions, stood on the porch of his modest home. He watched as the water inched higher, swallowing the street inch by inch. "Lucas, stay inside," his mother Clara called out, her voice tight with fear. "It's not safe out there." "I'll be careful," Lucas replied, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Lucas had never been one to sit idly by when others were in danger. As the waters surged closer to the houses in their neighborhood, he saw people scrambling to higher ground. But amidst the rising panic, one figure caught his eye, a frail, elderly woman, struggling to cling to a submerged lamppost as the floodwaters pulled her further from safety. It was Mrs. Evelyn, the retired schoolteacher who lived a few blocks down. She had always been kind to Lucas, often waving at him from her garden or sharing stories from her youth when he stopped by to help with her groceries. Now she was trapped, her cries for help barely audible over the roar of the storm. Lucas didn't hesitate. His mother's warnings faded into the background as he shrugged off his raincoat and plunged into the icy water. The cold hit him like a slap, stealing his breath, but he forced himself forward. Every step was a battle against the current, and debris swirled around him like deadly obstacles. "Hold on, Mrs. Evelyn!" he shouted, though his voice felt small against the storm's wrath. The elderly woman's eyes widened as she saw him approaching. "Lucas, no! You'll be swept away." But Lucas pressed on, his legs burning as he fought the water's relentless pull. When he finally reached her, he grabbed hold of her wrist with one hand and a nearby branch with the other. The current tugged at them mercilessly, but Lucas refused to let go. With every ounce of strength he had, Lucas pulled Mrs. Evelyn closer until her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Together, they inched toward the nearest tree, which offered a precarious perch just above the rushing water. "Stay here," Lucas urged. "I'll get help." "No, Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've done enough." But Lucas couldn't rest yet. He searched the area, spotting a small boat abandoned by the side of a submerged road. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he swam to it, clambered aboard, and paddled back to Mrs. Evelyn. He helped her into the boat, ignoring the pain in his arms and the numbing cold that seeped into his bones. With slow, deliberate movements, he steered them toward higher ground, where neighbors had gathered. Cheers erupted as they arrived, and hands reached out to pull Mrs. Evelyn to safety. Lucas collapsed on the ground, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The rain began to ease, and as he looked up at the thinning clouds, he felt a strange calm settle over him. "Lucas, you're a hero!" someone exclaimed. But Lucas shook his head. "I just did what anyone should." As the storm abated and the floodwaters began to recede, Lucas trudged home, soaked to the bone, but relieved. He didn't think much of his actions. He hadn't done it for praise. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The next day, as the sun broke through the clouds and the streets lay littered with debris, Lucas was helping his mother clear their yard when the low rumble of an engine drew their attention. A sleek black car, polished to a mirror-like shine, rolled to a stop in front of their house. Lucas exchanged a glance with his mother, confusion etched across both their faces. The driver, a man dressed in a crisp suit, stepped out and approached with measured steps. "Are you Lucas Harper?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "Yes," Lucas replied cautiously. The driver smiled faintly and handed him a sealed envelope. "This is for you, from someone deeply grateful for what you did yesterday." Lucas took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. As he opened it, he found a handwritten note and something else that made him freeze in disbelief. Lucas's fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter inside the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, and the handwriting was elegant, each word written with care. His mother stood behind him, peering over his shoulder, her curiosity as intense as his own. The letter read, "Dear Lucas, I have heard of your bravery and selflessness during the storm. Saving Mrs. Evelyn from the flood was an act of immense courage, one that inspires hope in a time when it is needed most. Words cannot adequately express my gratitude. Enclosed is a gesture of thanks, a small token to help you and your family recover after the storm. But more than that, I hope to meet you in person. Your actions deserve recognition, and I believe your story can inspire others. Please be ready tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I will come to your home to speak with you directly. With deepest gratitude, Michael Aldridge." Lucas's eyes widened as he reached into the envelope again, pulling out a check. The amount made him gasp audibly. "Lucas?" his mother whispered, her eyes narrowing with concern. "It's a check," Lucas managed to say. His voice was unsteady, and his throat felt dry. "For $5,000. Clara clasped her hand over her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. "5,000? Lucas, this could fix so much. Our roof, the car, maybe even help some of the neighbors." Lucas nodded slowly, still reeling from the shock. "And this man, Michael Aldridge, he's coming tomorrow." "Michael Aldridge," Clara repeated, the name sparking recognition. "Lucas, he's the owner of Aldridge Industries. He's one of the wealthiest men in the state." Lucas turned to his mother, confused. "Why would someone like him care about what I did?" Clara placed her hands on his shoulders, her voice soft but firm. "Because what you did wasn't ordinary, Lucas. You risked your life to save someone else's. That doesn't go unnoticed, especially by someone who understands the value of compassion." In that night, Lucas barely slept. Thoughts swirled in his head, of Mrs. Evelyn's trembling hands as he pulled her from the flood, of the neighbors cheering as they reached safety, of the letter now sitting on the kitchen table. Part of him felt proud, but another part felt overwhelmed. He wasn't a hero. He was just a kid who couldn't stand by and do nothing. By morning, the town had begun to stir with life again. The storm had left its mark: fallen trees, damaged houses, and streets slick with mud. But the people of Riverbend were resilient. Lucas saw his neighbors helping each other, sharing supplies, and working to clean up the aftermath. At exactly 10 a.m., the sleek black car pulled up in front of their house once more. Lucas and Clara stepped outside to meet it, their nerves evident in the way they stood side by side, shoulders squared, but hearts racing. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with silver hair neatly combed back, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed impervious to the dust and dirt around him. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Lucas, and he smiled warmly. "You must be Lucas Harper," he said, extending his hand. "Yes, sir," Lucas replied, shaking his hand firmly. "And you must be Mrs. Harper," the man continued, nodding respectfully at Clara. "I'm Michael Aldridge." "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Aldridge," Clara said, her voice polite but cautious. "The honor is mine," Michael replied, his gaze returning to Lucas. "You're quite the talk of Riverbend, young man. What you did for Mrs. Evelyn was nothing short of remarkable." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his mud-streaked sneakers. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. Michael's expression softened. "I think you underestimate the rarity of true courage. Many people might feel compassion, but few act on it, especially when their own safety is at risk." He gestured toward the car. "May we sit? There's something I'd like to discuss." The three of them settled on the porch, the black car gleaming in the sunlight behind them. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Lucas, I've spent my life building a business, creating opportunities, and giving back to communities. But none of that matters without people like you, people who remind us what humanity is all about." Lucas listened intently, his unease giving way to curiosity. "I want to do more than thank you," Michael continued. "I want to use your story to inspire others. I believe people need to hear about what you did. It could encourage them to help their neighbors, to stand up for what's right, even in the face of danger." Lucas blinked, unsure how to respond. "I don't know about all that," he said hesitantly. "I'm just a regular guy. I'm not a hero." Michael chuckled. "The best heroes never think of themselves that way. But let me be clear. This isn't just about you. It's about creating a ripple effect. Your courage can spark something much bigger." He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. "I'd like to sponsor a community initiative in Riverbend, a program that promotes neighborly support, emergency preparedness, and acts of kindness. With your help, Lucas, we can make that happen." Lucas exchanged a glance with his mother, whose expression was a mixture of pride and awe. "I don't know," Lucas said slowly. "I've never done anything like that before." Michael smiled, his eyes twinkling. "You saved a life, Lucas. That's more than most people can say. The rest is just figuring out how to share what's already inside you." Lucas sat back, his mind racing. The idea of being part of something bigger, of making a lasting impact on his community, both excited and terrified him. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice steady. Michael nodded, standing. "That's all I ask. Take your time." He turned to Clara, shaking her hand again. "Mrs. Harper, you've raised a remarkable son. It was a pleasure meeting you both." As the black car disappeared down the road, Lucas sat on the porch, staring at the business card in his hand. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking, Lucas?" she asked. Lucas looked out at the neighborhood, the people, the rebuilding, the resilience. He thought of Mrs. Evelyn's grateful smile, the neighbors who had cheered for him, and Michael's words about the ripple effect. "I'm thinking," Lucas said, a small smile forming on his lips, "that maybe I can do more." The next morning, Lucas woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the cool morning air carried the faint scent of damp earth and the distant chirping of birds. His mother was in the kitchen frying eggs, her movements calm but deliberate. "You're up early," Clara said without turning around. "Couldn't sleep," Lucas admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. He had spent most of the night staring at Michael Aldridge's business card, turning it over in his hands, as if the answers he needed would reveal themselves. Clara placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, her face thoughtful. "You've got a lot on your mind, don't you?" Lucas nodded, taking a bite of toast. "What if I mess it up, Mom? What if I'm not cut out for this ripple effect thing he's talking about?" Clara sat down across from him, resting her elbows on the table. "Lucas, no one's asking you to have all the answers. Michael came to you because of who you are, because you acted when it mattered. That's all this is about, being yourself." Her words settled over him like a comforting blanket, but the weight of responsibility still lingered. He wasn't sure he could live up to the expectations being placed on him. By mid-morning, Lucas decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The streets, though still muddy, were alive with activity. People were working together to clean up debris, patch roofs, and carry supplies. Every face he passed greeted him warmly, some with a smile, others with a nod of gratitude. "Lucas!" He turned to see Mrs. Evelyn standing on her porch, leaning on her cane. Her house, which had been flooded just days ago, was now surrounded by stacks of wooden planks and tools. "Good morning, Mrs. Evelyn," Lucas said, walking over. "Morning, my dear," she said, her voice brimming with warmth. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to see this sunshine today." Lucas shifted awkwardly. "I just did what anyone would have done." Mrs. Evelyn's smile widened, her eyes twinkling with a mix of humor and affection. "If that were true, Lucas, we'd have a lot more heroes in this world." Before Lucas could respond, another voice called out, "Hey, Lucas!" It was Mr. Jenkins, a middle-aged man who owned the hardware store down the street. He was loading wooden beams into a wheelbarrow, his shirt damp with sweat. "You got a minute?" Lucas jogged over. "Sure, Mr. Jenkins. What's up?" Mr. Jenkins wiped his brow, giving Lucas a tired but grateful smile. "Word's gotten around about what you did for Mrs. Evelyn. People are saying you've inspired them to help out more, to watch out for each other. I've seen neighbors working together who barely spoke before." "That's great," Lucas said, feeling a flicker of pride. Mr. Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. "It's more than great, kid. It's exactly what this town needed. If you've got time, we could use an extra set of hands fixing up Mrs. Carter's place. Her roof's a mess." Lucas nodded without hesitation. "I'll be there." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Lucas worked alongside his neighbors, hauling beams, hammering nails, and clearing debris. It was hard, sweaty work, but it didn't feel like a chore. The sense of camaraderie was contagious, and Lucas found himself smiling despite the ache in his arms and back. By late afternoon, Mrs. Carter's roof was patched, and the group gathered on her porch, sharing lemonade and stories. "To Lucas," someone said, raising their glass. Lucas held up his hands, embarrassed. "Come on, it's not just me. Everyone's pitching in." "But you started it," Mrs. Carter said, her voice firm. "If you hadn't risked your life for Mrs. Evelyn, none of us would have remembered what it means to truly be neighbors." Her words struck a chord with Lucas. Maybe Michael Aldridge was right. Maybe what he had done wasn't just about saving one person. It was about reminding people of the power of community. That evening, as Lucas sat on the porch with his mother and Mia, he told them about his day. It felt good, helping people, seeing everyone come together like that. Clara smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "That's the ripple effect, Lucas. You've already started it." Mia, who had been doodling in her notebook, looked up. "Does that mean more people are going to help each other now?" Lucas ruffled her hair. "I hope so, Mia. That's the idea." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Lucas's mind returned to Michael Aldridge's offer. The fear of failing still lingered, but it was joined by something else, a spark of possibility. "I think I'm going to call him," Lucas said suddenly. Clara looked at him, her expression both surprised and supportive. "Are you sure?" Lucas nodded, determination settling over him like armor. "If this can help more people, then it's worth a shot." The next morning, Lucas dialed the number on the business card. It rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Michael Aldridge speaking." "Hi, Mr. Aldridge. It's Lucas Harper." "Lucas!" Michael's voice brightened. "I was hoping to hear from you. Have you given some thought to what we discussed?" "I have," Lucas said, his voice steady. "I want to be part of it. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." There was a brief pause. Then Michael's voice came through, filled with sincerity. "You've made the right choice, Lucas. This is going to change lives, not just here in Riverbend, but beyond." "What happens next?" Lucas asked. Michael's answer carried the weight of promise. "Next, we start building something bigger than any of us could imagine." Lucas couldn't shake the nervous energy that clung to him as the days passed. After agreeing to Michael Aldridge's offer, he found himself at the center of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. True to his word, Michael wasted no time putting the plan in motion. A week after their phone call, Lucas stood in front of the Riverbend Community Center. It was a modest building, still showing signs of damage from the flood, but today it buzzed with new life. Trucks unloaded supplies, wood, paint, tools, and stacks of printed posters, and volunteers milled around, ready to lend a hand. "Lucas, over here!" Michael Aldridge waved from the steps of the building. He looked just as polished as the day Lucas first met him, but his demeanor was warm and inviting. Standing beside him was a young woman with a clipboard, her sharp eyes scanning the activity around them. Glad you could make it, Michael said, extending his hand. Lucas shook it, glancing nervously at the bustling crowd. This is a lot. Are all these people here because of me? Michael chuckled. Partially. But mostly they're here because of what you represent, the power of a single act of courage to inspire a community. The woman stepped forward, smiling. I'm Elena, Mr. Aldridge's project coordinator. We're organizing the first phase of the initiative today, and we're counting on you to help us lead it. Lucas blinked. Lead it? I don't know if I'm ready for that. You're more ready than you think, Michael said, clapping him on the shoulder. You've already proven that leadership isn't about titles, it's about actions. Over the next few hours, Lucas was swept up in the whirlwind of activity. Elena showed him the plans. A series of neighborhood cleanup events, safety workshops, and resource drives aimed at helping Riverbend recover and prepare for future emergencies. You'll be the face of this project, Elena explained as they walked through the community center's main hall, where volunteers were setting up tables and arranging supplies. We want people to see what can happen when someone steps up and takes action. Lucas felt the weight of her words, but nodded. He might not have all the answers, but he was willing to try. The first major event took place 2 days later. Lucas stood on a makeshift stage in the park, a microphone in hand, as dozens of townspeople gathered. Some were familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and even Mrs. Evelyn, who smiled warmly at him from the front row. Others were strangers who had heard about the project and wanted to help. Lucas took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing, but this moment felt important. Hi everyone, he began, his voice shaky. The crowd went quiet, their eyes fixed on him. I'm not really used to this, Lucas admitted, earning a few chuckles. But I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for helping out, and for proving that when things get tough, we can come together and make a difference. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. When the storm hit, I didn't think about being a hero or making a ripple effect. I just saw someone who needed help. And I think that's something we all have inside us, the ability to see when something's wrong and do something about it. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Lucas felt a spark of confidence. This isn't just about cleaning up after the flood, he continued. It's about building something stronger, a community where we look out for each other, where no one gets left behind. And I'm proud to be part of that. Applause erupted, and Lucas stepped back from the microphone, his face flushed, but his heart swelling with pride. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Lucas threw himself into the project, working alongside volunteers to organize events, distribute supplies, and repair damaged homes. He became a familiar sight around town, whether he was hammering nails, stacking sandbags, or comforting a neighbor who had lost everything. The impact of the initiative was undeniable. Families who had been struggling to recover found support in the form of donations and manpower. The safety workshops, led by local firefighters and emergency responders, taught residents how to prepare for future disasters. And perhaps most importantly, the sense of isolation and despair that had lingered after the storm began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of hope. One afternoon, as Lucas was painting the exterior of Mrs. Carter's house, Michael Aldridge arrived unexpectedly. "Looking good, Lucas," Michael said, shielding his eyes from the sun as he admired the fresh coat of paint. Lucas climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks. What brings you by?" "I wanted to share some news," Michael said, his tone serious but optimistic. "Word of what we're doing here has spread. Other towns affected by the storm have reached out, asking if we can bring the initiative to them." Lucas's eyes widened. "You mean this could go beyond Riverbend?" "Exactly," Michael said, smiling. "Your story, Lucas, it's inspired more people than you realize. But if we're going to expand, I'll need your help." "My help?" Lucas asked, his voice rising in surprise. Michael nodded. "You're the heart of this movement. People connect with your story because it's real. It's genuine. If you're willing, I'd like you to come with me to these other towns, to share your experience and help us grow this project." Lucas felt a surge of emotions, excitement, fear, and pride all rolled into one. The idea of stepping out of his comfort zone, of speaking to strangers about his journey, was daunting, but the thought of making an even bigger impact was impossible to ignore. "I'll do it," Lucas said finally, his voice steady. "If it means helping more people, I'm in." That night, Lucas sat on the porch with his mother and Mia, staring up at the stars. "You're really going to do it?" Clara asked, her voice a mixture of pride and concern. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, it feels like the right thing to do." Mia snuggled up next to him, clutching her stuffed bear. "You're going to be famous, Lucas," she said with a giggle. Lucas chuckled, ruffling her hair. "It's not about being famous, Mia. It's about helping people." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining. "You've always had a big heart, Lucas. I'm proud of you." As Lucas sat there, surrounded by the people he loved, he felt a deep sense of purpose settle over him. The storm had taken so much from their community, but it had also given him a chance to make a difference, one that would ripple far beyond Riverbend. The morning Lucas left Riverbend was quiet, but charged with emotion. The black sedan from Aldridge Industries idled in front of his home, its engine a low hum that matched the energy coursing through Lucas. He stood on the porch, his backpack slung over one shoulder, as his mother and Mia hugged him tightly. "You be safe out there," Clara said, her voice wavering as she pulled back to look at him. "I know you're doing something important, but I can't help worrying." "I'll be fine, Mom," Lucas reassured her. "Michael said it's just a few days in each town. I'll be back before you know it." Mia tugged at his sleeve, her face scrunched in a mixture of pride and sadness. "You promise you'll call me every night?" Lucas knelt, pulling her into a hug. "Every night," he said. "And you better keep practicing those drawings while I'm gone, okay?" Mia nodded, sniffling, as Lucas stood and gave his mother one last look. "I'll make you proud, Mom." "You already have," Clara said, her smile bittersweet. The ride to the first town, Clearwater, was quiet at first. Lucas sat beside Michael Aldridge in the back seat, gazing out the window as the countryside rolled past. The fields, still soggy from the storm, mirrored Riverbend's struggles. "Feeling nervous?" Michael asked, breaking the silence. "A little," Lucas admitted. "I'm not sure what to say when I get there. I mean, I'm just a kid who did what anyone else would have done." Michael smiled knowingly. "Lucas, I've seen men 3 times your age shy away from situations like the one you faced. What you did wasn't ordinary. That's why people listen when you speak. It's not about being perfect or knowing all the answers. It's about being real." Lucas nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. "I just hope I can live up to their expectations." Clearwater was smaller than Riverbend, with a single main street and a handful of clustered neighborhoods. The damage from the flood was painfully visible. Houses with water-stained walls, abandoned cars sitting half-submerged in ditches, and piles of debris stacked high on the curbs. Michael and Lucas were greeted by Mayor Angela Vasquez, a petite woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a handshake that belied her size. "Thank you for coming," Angela said, leading them toward the town square. "Clearwater's been struggling to get back on its feet, and your project has given us some hope." Lucas swallowed his nerves as he followed her. In the square, a small crowd had gathered. Families, local business owners, and volunteers ready to work. Michael stepped up first, taking the microphone and addressing the group with his usual polished ease. He spoke of resilience, of community, and of Lucas's bravery in Riverbend. Then, With a practiced gesture, he handed the microphone to Lucas. The crowd turned to him, their faces expectant. Lucas took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm Lucas Harper from Riverbend. Like you, my town got hit hard by the storm. We lost homes, cars, and, well, a sense of normalcy." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. But something happened in the middle of all that chaos. People came together. Neighbors who barely knew each other started helping out, sharing what they had, and looking out for one another. "That's how I was able to save Mrs. Evelyn." He gestured toward the damaged houses in the distance. "I know it's overwhelming, standing here and looking at everything that's been lost, but I promise you, if we come together, we can rebuild, stronger and better than before." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lucas stepped back, his heart racing, but filled with a sense of accomplishment. The days in Clearwater were busy and rewarding. Lucas worked alongside the townspeople, helping to clean up debris and distribute supplies. He shared stories of Riverbend's recovery efforts, offering tips and encouragement to those who felt overwhelmed. One afternoon, as he helped a young boy repair his bicycle, an older man approached him. "Lucas, right?" the man said, his voice gruff but kind. "Yes, sir," Lucas replied, standing and brushing dirt off his hands. "I wanted to thank you," the man said. "My wife and we've been struggling to see a way forward, but seeing you here, hearing what you've done, it's given us hope." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm just glad I can help." The man nodded, his expression serious. "You're doing more than that. You're reminding people that we're not alone in this." After a week in Clearwater, Lucas and Michael moved on to two more towns, Lakeshore and Millfield. Each had its own unique challenges, but the common thread was the determination of the people to rebuild. Lucas's confidence grew with each stop. He found himself speaking more freely, connecting with residents, and offering not just advice, but inspiration. He saw firsthand how the ripple effect was spreading, how his story was motivating others to take action in their own communities. One evening, after a long day of work in Millfield, Lucas sat with Michael by a campfire near their temporary base. "You're a natural at this," Michael said, sipping a cup of coffee. "I knew you'd be good, but I didn't realize just how far your reach could go." Lucas stared into the flames, his voice thoughtful. "It's not just me. It's the people. Everyone I've met. They're the real reason things are changing." Michael nodded. "And that's what makes you so powerful, Lucas. You understand that this isn't about you. It's about all of us. You've tapped into something bigger than yourself." Lucas smiled faintly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time, he believed that his actions could create real, lasting change. As the journey continued, Lucas kept his promise to call home every night. Mia excitedly told him about her latest drawings, and Clara shared updates about the progress in Riverbend. "We miss you, Lucas," Clara said one evening, her voice warm but tinged with longing. "But we're so proud of you. You're making a difference." "Thanks, Mom," Lucas replied, his voice soft. "I'll be home soon." The journey had been exhausting but rewarding. Lucas's name was quickly becoming known across the region, not as some celebrity, but as a symbol of resilience and community strength. The towns he visited were beginning to show signs of revival. Damaged homes patched up, neighbors looking out for one another, and conversations of hope where despair had once reigned. But as his work expanded, so did the challenges. Not everyone welcomed change, and not everyone believed in the vision he was helping to build. Lucas arrived in Bramblewood, a small town nestled between hills, its streets still caked with dried mud from the flood. Unlike the other towns, the air here felt heavy with mistrust. The people weren't gathering eagerly like in Clearwater or Millfield. Instead, they kept to themselves, peering cautiously from windows or shuffling away when Lucas or Michael approached. "This place feels different," Lucas said as they walked down the main street. Michael nodded, his expression pensive. Bramblewood's been hit hard, not just by the storm, but by years of economic struggles. People here are wary of outsiders. It's going to take more than words to win them over. The mayor of Bramblewood, a wiry man named Edwin Shaw, greeted them at the town hall. His handshake was brief, and his eyes darted around nervously. "We appreciate you coming," Edwin said, though his tone didn't quite match the sentiment. "But I'm not sure how much you'll accomplish here. Folks around here are set in their ways." Lucas frowned. "Everyone deserves help, Mayor Shaw. We're here to listen and see what we can do." The mayor sighed, gesturing toward the empty square outside. "Well, good luck. You'll need it." That afternoon, Lucas and Elena set up a table in the square, offering supplies and information about the recovery initiative. A few curious onlookers stopped by but left quickly, their skepticism clear. "It's like they're afraid to trust us," Lucas muttered, watching a man hurry away with a box of donated food. "They're afraid to hope," Elena said quietly. "When you've been let down enough times, it's hard to believe that things can get better." Lucas thought about Riverbend, about the days after the flood, when even he had doubted that they'd recover. He understood the weight of hopelessness, and it only fueled his determination. Ingdatu. As the days passed, Lucas found small cracks in Bramblewood's wall of mistrust. A young boy named Ollie approached the table one afternoon, his clothes muddy, but his smile bright. "Are you the guy who saved that lady from drowning?" Ollie asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Lucas chuckled, kneeling to meet his gaze. "I guess that's me." "Wow," Ollie said, bouncing on his heels. "Mom says you're wasting your time here, but I think what you're doing is cool." Lucas glanced over Ollie's shoulder and saw a woman watching from a distance. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was wary, but she didn't call Ollie back. "What's your name?" Lucas asked. "Ollie." "Well, Ollie, why don't you help me hand out some of these supplies?" The boy's face lit up, and soon he was darting around the square, handing out cans of food and packets of seeds to anyone who would take them. His enthusiasm drew a few more people into the square, and Lucas used the opportunity to strike up conversations, sharing stories of Riverbend and encouraging neighbors to help one another. By the end of the week, Bramblewood was beginning to thaw. The square was livelier, and more people had joined the cleanup efforts Lucas had organized. Still, not everyone was on board. One evening, as Lucas was wrapping up for the day, a man approached him. He was tall, with calloused hands, and a face weathered by years of hardship. "You're wasting your time here," the man said bluntly. Lucas turned, meeting his gaze. "I don't think so. I've seen people start to come together, start to believe things can get better." The man snorted. "People always show up after a disaster, handing out supplies and making promises. But when the cameras leave, so do they. Why should we believe you're any different?" Lucas's chest tightened. He understood the man's frustration, but it still stung. "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm here because I believe that when people come together, they can make real change. You don't have to trust me, but at least give your neighbors a chance." The man studied him for a long moment before walking away without another word. Near that night, as Lucas sat in his makeshift camp with Michael and Elena, he felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. "Am I even making a difference here?" he asked, staring into the flickering fire. Michael leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Lucas, and the places that need it most are often the hardest to reach. But you've already planted seeds here. Give them time to grow." Elena nodded. "You connected with that boy, Ollie, and people are talking, Even if they're not ready to say it to your face, don't underestimate the power of small steps. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want them to believe it's possible, that we're all stronger together. The next day brought an unexpected turning point. Ollie's mother, the same woman who had watched from a distance, arrived at the square with a group of neighbors. "We want to help," she said, her voice firm but tinged with vulnerability. Lucas blinked in surprise. "Really?" She nodded, glancing at her son, who stood beside her, beaming. "Ollie hasn't stopped talking about you, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's time we stop waiting for someone else to fix things and start helping each other." The group's involvement sparked a chain reaction. More residents began showing up, sharing tools, offering labor, and building connections that hadn't existed before. By the end of the week, Bramblewood's transformation was undeniable. As Lucas prepared to leave, Mayor Shaw approached him, his demeanor much warmer than it had been at their first meeting. "You proved me wrong," the mayor admitted. "I didn't think anyone could get through to this town, but you did." Lucas smiled, shaking his hand. "I didn't do it alone. Your people were ready. They just needed a little push." The mayor nodded. "Well, you've given us more than a push. You've given us hope. Thank you, Lucas." As the black sedan pulled away from Bramblewood, Lucas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The town had been his hardest challenge yet, but it had also been his greatest victory. Michael glanced at him, a proud smile on his face. "I told you, Lucas. Your story is powerful. You're changing lives." Lucas stared out the window, the sun setting over the hills. "It's not just my story," he said quietly. "It's everyone's story. We're all part of this." The success in Bramblewood had reinvigorated Lucas's spirit. For the first time since the flood, he felt like he was making a meaningful, lasting impact. Yet with every success came new challenges. As Michael Aldridge's initiative expanded, so did the expectations placed on Lucas. Their next stop was a larger city, Greenhaven, which had been heavily impacted by the storm. The damage here was staggering. Entire neighborhoods had been gutted by floodwaters, and shelters were overcrowded with families who had lost everything. The sheer scale of the devastation was overwhelming. Lucas stared out of the car window as they drove into the city. Streets were littered with broken furniture, soaked mattresses, and debris. Volunteers in bright vests worked tirelessly, but it felt like an uphill battle. "Greenhaven is different from the smaller towns we've worked with," Michael said, his tone serious. "It's bigger, more chaotic, and while there's more help here, there's also more tension." Lucas nodded, though his chest tightened. He wasn't sure how one person, even with a growing reputation, could make a difference in a place like this. The first meeting in Greenhaven was held at a local community center, a large but worn building that had been repurposed as a shelter. Lucas sat on stage beside Michael and a few city leaders, scanning the crowd of residents, volunteers, and local officials. The room buzzed with a mixture of hope and frustration. When it was Lucas's turn to speak, he stood and took a deep breath. "Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas Harper from Riverbend," he began. His voice carried over the crowd, but it didn't feel as steady as it had in the smaller towns. "I know things feel impossible right now. I've seen the damage the storm left behind, and I've heard the stories of what you've lost." The room fell silent as Lucas continued. "But I've also seen something incredible. In Riverbend, and in the towns I've visited since, people are coming together. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers offering their time and resources. That's what got us through in my hometown, and that's what will get Greenhaven through, too." He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. "I don't have all the answers, but I know this. When we work together, we can do things that seem impossible. I believe in that, and I believe in all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, though Lucas noticed a few skeptical faces. He stepped back, his heart racing. Over the next few days, Lucas worked alongside Greenhaven residents, focusing on one neighborhood at a time. The magnitude of the city's recovery efforts was daunting, but he stayed committed, meeting families, listening to their stories, and lending a hand wherever he could. One family, the Reynoldses, made a lasting impression. They had lost nearly everything. Their home was gutted, their belongings destroyed, but they refused to give up. Mr. Reynolds, a tall man with a booming voice, organized cleanup crews in his neighborhood, while Mrs. Reynolds ran a makeshift kitchen to feed volunteers. "Lucas," Mr. Reynolds called out one afternoon as Lucas helped clear debris from their yard. "You've been busting your back for days. Come on in and grab some food before you drop." Lucas followed him inside, where the smell of homemade stew filled the air. The Reynolds' teenage daughter, Kayla, handed him a steaming bowl, her expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Thanks for everything you're doing," Kayla said as Lucas sat at their small table. "It's not just me," Lucas replied. "Everyone's pitching in." Kayla smiled faintly. "Still, it means a lot. People listen to you. You make them believe things can get better." Lucas looked down at his bowl, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "I just want to help," he said softly. But not everyone in Greenhaven was supportive. Some residents grew frustrated with the slow pace of recovery, and tensions between different neighborhoods began to flare. One afternoon, as Lucas helped organize supplies at a distribution center, a heated argument broke out between two groups of residents. "Why does their block get more supplies than ours?" one man shouted, his face red with anger. "We've got more people to take care of," another man retorted. The shouting escalated, drawing a crowd. Lucas stepped forward, raising his hands. "Hey, stop!" he called out, his voice firm. The crowd turned to him, their frustration palpable. "This isn't helping," Lucas said, his heart pounding. "I know everyone's struggling, and it feels like there's not enough to go around. But fighting each other isn't going to fix anything. We need to work together." A few people murmured in agreement, but others still looked skeptical. Lucas took a deep breath. "I get it. You're tired, angry, and scared. But I've seen what we can do when we put that aside. We've done it in Riverbend, Clearwater, and Bramblewood. Greenhaven can do it too, but only if we stop tearing each other down." The crowd slowly dispersed, though the tension lingered. Elena approached Lucas afterward, her expression thoughtful. "You handled that well," she said. "I don't know," Lucas replied, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like there's always another fire to put out." "That's part of the job," Elena said. "But don't underestimate the impact of what you're doing. You're giving people a reason to hope." Despite the challenges, progress in Greenhaven continued. By the end of the week, several neighborhoods had been cleaned up, and more residents were stepping forward to volunteer. Lucas's efforts earned him the respect of many who had initially doubted him, and the initiative began to gain momentum across the city. As Lucas prepared to leave Greenhaven, the Reynoldses hosted a small farewell dinner for him. "You've done more for this city than you realize," Mr. Reynolds said, raising a glass. "Don't stop now, kid. The world needs people like you." Lucas smiled, though his exhaustion was evident. "Thanks, Mr. Reynolds. I'm just glad I could help." As he left the city that night, Lucas felt a mix of pride and weariness. The road ahead was still long, but he was more determined than ever to keep going. Dirham di Kaur in the car, Michael turned to Lucas, his expression serious. "You've done incredible work, Lucas, but I need to ask, how are you holding up?" Lucas stared out the window, his thoughts heavy. "It's harder than I thought it would be," he admitted. "There's so much pain out there, and I can't fix all of it. But I can't stop either. Not when I've seen what's possible." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "You're right. You can't fix everything, But you've already shown that even small actions can create big changes. That's what matters. Lucas leaned back in his seat, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. I just hope it's enough. Michael smiled faintly. It already is. Lucas stared out of the car window as the lights of Riverbend came into view. After weeks of traveling from town to town, helping communities recover from the storm, the sight of home brought a wave of relief. The familiar streets were quieter now, but they carried a sense of resilience. People had rebuilt their lives, bit by bit, and Lucas knew he'd played a small role in that. The car came to a stop in front of his house, and Lucas stepped out, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Clara and Mia were already on the porch, their faces lighting up as they saw him. "You're back!" Mia cried, running to him and wrapping her arms around his waist. Lucas hugged her tightly, smiling through his exhaustion. "I told you I'd be back." Clara approached, her eyes glistening with pride. "Welcome home, Lucas." "Thanks, Mom," Lucas said, his voice soft. "It's good to be back." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lucas shared stories from his journey. The towns he'd visited, the people he'd met, and the challenges they'd faced together. Clara listened intently, her expression a mix of awe and concern. "You've done so much," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Lucas shrugged, his cheeks flushing. "I just did what I could. There's still so much to be done." "But you've started something, Lucas," Clara said. "Something bigger than yourself. That's not small." Mia piped up, holding up one of her drawings. "I made this while you were gone. It's you saving people." Lucas took the drawing, his heart swelling. It showed him standing on a rooftop, helping someone climb to safety. The simplicity of it captured everything he'd been trying to do. "This is amazing, Mia," Lucas said, pulling her into a hug. The next morning, Lucas woke early and stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, and the streets of Riverbend were alive with activity. He saw neighbors working together, fixing roofs, painting fences, and clearing debris. It was a stark contrast to the chaos after the storm, and it filled Lucas with hope. "Lucas!" He turned to see Mrs. Evelyn waving from her garden. Her house had been fully restored, and she looked stronger than she had in months. "Good morning, Mrs. Evelyn," Lucas said, walking over. "Good morning, my dear," she replied. "I heard about all the work you've been doing. You've become quite the hero." Lucas smiled sheepishly. "I don't know about that. I just wanted to help." "And you did," she said firmly. "Not just here, but in every town you visited. You've reminded people what it means to care for one another." Her words stayed with Lucas as he continued down the street, greeting neighbors and soaking in the sense of community that had grown stronger since the storm. Later that day, Michael Aldridge arrived in Riverbend for one final meeting. He and Lucas sat on the porch, overlooking the street. "You've done something incredible, Lucas," Michael said. "This initiative has grown beyond anything I imagined. People are reaching out from across the state, asking how they can bring this kind of change to their communities." Lucas nodded, though he felt a pang of doubt. "But what happens next? I can't be everywhere at once." Michael smiled. "That's the beauty of it. You don't have to be. You've sparked something that others can carry forward. Your story, your actions, they've inspired people to step up in their own towns. That's the ripple effect." Lucas leaned back, his thoughts turning to the people he'd met on his journey. He thought of Ollie, the Reynoldses, and the residents of Bramblewood and Greenhaven. Each of them had taken what he'd started and made it their own. "What about here?" Lucas asked. "In Riverbend?" Michael's expression softened. "Riverbend will always be your foundation, and from what I've seen, your neighbors are ready to take the lead. You've given them the tools they need to keep going." Lucas nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Sir." Then that evening, The town gathered in the park for a celebration. String lights hung between trees, and tables were filled with food and drinks. Lucas stood near the stage, watching as families laughed and talked, their faces glowing in the warm light. When it was time for speeches, Michael took the microphone first, thanking the community for their resilience and recognizing Lucas for his efforts. Lucas Harper showed us that one act of courage can spark a movement, Michael said. He reminded us that we're stronger together, and for that, we are forever grateful. The crowd erupted into applause as Michael stepped back and gestured for Lucas to take the stage. Lucas hesitated, his nerves prickling, but the sight of his family and neighbors gave him strength. He took the microphone, his voice steady as he spoke. "I don't think of myself as a hero," Lucas began. "I'm just someone who saw a chance to help and took it. But what I've learned over the past few weeks is that every single one of us has that same chance. It doesn't take a flood or a storm to make a difference. It just takes kindness, courage, and the willingness to act." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We've been through a lot, but we've come out stronger because we came together. And I believe we can keep that going, not just here in Riverbend, but everywhere." The crowd cheered, their voices filled with pride and determination. As the celebration wound down, Lucas stood with his mother and Mia, watching the stars appear in the night sky. "You did good, Lucas," Clara said, her voice warm. Lucas smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We all did, Mom. That's what matters." Mia leaned against his side, clutching her stuffed bear. "Do you think things will stay good?" Lucas looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think as long as we remember to help each other, they will." In the weeks that followed, Lucas's story continued to inspire others. Articles were written, interviews were conducted, and more communities joined the initiative. But for Lucas, the real reward was seeing the change in Riverbend, the friendships formed, the barriers broken, and the unwavering spirit of a town that refused to give up. And as he stood on his porch one quiet morning, watching the sun rise over his rebuilt neighborhood, Lucas knew one thing for certain: the ripple effect would never stop.